Okay, webinar is being recorded. We're live. Thanks everyone for attending this month's webinar. We really appreciate everyone who's in on Zoom and in on Facebook Live. It's seemingly rare that we have a stream or a system that has really good data, relatively good data for BC, and some scientists who have spent a lot of time thinking about what's gone on in those systems and how things have been affected. And that brings us to Dr. Wilson here. So tonight's presentation is going to be focusing in on the Kee River, and Dr. Wilson is going to kind of take us through how they figured out where things were changing and why in terms of the marine and the freshwater environment. So the format is the usual format for the webinar series. Dr. Wilson is going to present probably 40 to 45 minutes. And then we'll move over to question and answer function for 15 to 30 minutes. And so for all of you out there, again, Dr. Wilson is not a politician or a policymaker. He is a scientist. So if you have questions related to science, he can definitely answer them. If you have questions around policy or management, some of them he may be able to answer, some of them he may not. And so if you feel your blood pressure rising, feel free to engage your elected officials and send your high blood pressure their way as opposed to Dr. Wilson's way. So for the Q&A, people who are coming in on Zoom, there's a Q&A function on your taskbar where you can ask the questions. I'll aggregate them and then ask them to Dr. Wilson. Same on Facebook Live, you can just put them in the comments, and Brian, who's on here as well, running everything behind the scenes, he'll send the questions to me. And if we have questions that overlap, I'll kind of put them together just so I'm not asking the same question twice. So that's the format. This series, webinar series, the objective here is to educate everyone and let them ask questions and help understand and learn. But the more important thing is for you to engage your peers and coworkers and the people that you go outdoors with and let them know what you're learning. Because if we just teach you or help you understand what's going on, it doesn't really help fish and wildlife. But if you talk to all of your friends and you talk to your MLAs and your MPs, then we can all drive change. I will talk about this at the end as well. The next webinar is coming up rapidly. It will be in the second week, I believe, of December. It's going to be Dr. Laurie Daniels and Bob Gray talking about wildfires and wildlife. So that's imminent. It's going to happen quickly, but it's going to be an awesome webinar. So with that, I'll introduce Dr. Kyle Wilson. He is an applied quantitative biologist at the Central Coast Indigenous Resource Alliance. He combines empirical and theoretical approaches to tackle a variety of challenges in applied ecology. His research focuses on understanding the social and ecological processes governing the resilience of marine, coastal, and freshwater fisheries. Much of his research occurs alongside Indigenous partners and government science colleagues and helps to inform co-management planning for sustainable fisheries. I'll save all of the technical stuff just to tell you that Dr. Wilson is extremely smart. And he's, you know, this paper was like, it's a phenomenal paper. So we've got a really sharp person here who has done a lot of work and spent a lot of time thinking about this river. And of course, you know, theoretically, this could apply to other parts of the province. So with that, Dr. Wilson, I'll turn it over to you. If you'd like to start your screen share, that would be awesome.
Yeah, here we go. Are you seeing that?
Got it. Perfect.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you for that introduction, Jesse. Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking a bit about multiple systems, not just the Keo, but focus in on the Keo a bit and presenting some long-term changes in population dynamics to a wide variety of different salmon populations and species in British Columbia. So overall, we're going to be talking about a bit about the marine and freshwater regime changes that we've been picking up on the Keo River. That includes Steelhead, Coastal Cutthroat, Dolly Varden, Coho Salmon, and Pink Salmon. In addition to that, we're going to then switch over to a more recent study that we've been working on at the Central Coast on productivity trends and harvest management in North and Central Coast Coho Salmon. I think it'll be together kind of tell a cohesive story about some of the ongoing concerns in salmon populations, not just trout and not just salmon, but kind of together in these salmon watersheds, what's going on. So salmon have this incredible life cycle and life history diversity, both across species and within species. They're defined by this really epic migration, both to and from the ocean, that takes them from egg and parr kind of rearing habitats in streams and rivers, out migrating to the ocean as smolts, where they're subjected to a wide variety of ocean changes before they come back as spawning adults to these rivers and spawn. For certain salmon species, they only do that once, but for trout and Dolly Varden and char species like Steelhead and Coastal Cutthroat included, they may repeat that journey multiple times. These species are vital to coastal communities, Indigenous communities across the province, and they're also huge socioeconomic interests from a wide variety of fisheries, including commercial and sport fishing operations. But in recent years, there's been a big decline in wild Pacific salmon throughout the province. And this has led to stark changes and opportunities for coastal people whose food security and economy have been supported by salmon for millennia. From 1985 to 2017, the number of commercial salmon licenses in BC has dropped by more than half. And across many communities, that story is the same. So in just over about 150 years, this colonial paradigm of centralized federal management of mixed stock fisheries has led to severe fishery collapses that has led to a wide variety of hardships and opportunities to potentially transform how we manage these populations and species. And we really need a robust understanding of these population dynamics and what's really driving these declines in order to guide and inform management. One of the central tenets of population ecology and sustainable fisheries in general is this idea of negative density dependence. And what that means is that as we harvest down adult stock or spawners, we should be triggering increases in per capita productivity that counters that decline. And this allows populations to recover from disturbance or harvest by boosting productivity at lower densities. So what happens though, when this density dependent population regime changes subsequently over time? We call these regime shifts, for example. So in this approach, we're going to be talking about using a Ricker density dependent model, where this alpha is a productivity term of maximum per capita productivity that salmon populations may have at low densities. And beta here is the slope or intensity of density dependence. One of the reasons why we're going to focus in on this Ricker model is that we can easily linearize it, turning it into a y equals mx plus b kind of an equation. And that's really useful for asking questions of what is impacting recruitment or in this case, smolt productivity changes through time. But wild salmon overall exhibit large shifts in productivity and population dynamics. And this is due to a wide variety of different processes. This includes rapid changes to the environment, as well as long-term and more persistent trends in what's really driving these systems. Some of the causes that have been attributed to these shifts in productivity have been ocean changes, freshwater changes, climate changes, harvest or overfishing concerns, species interactions, or other stochastic or random processes at play. But one of the big concerns with these long-term and more persistent trends that may be leading or underlying these declines is that it can really alter the regimes, the ecological regimes that are governing these salmon populations. And that can have big consequences to their resilience as they are able to recover or not recover from disturbances, as well as conservation targets that management may be seeking to improve upon. These shifts can be often difficult to detect because salmon are naturally highly variable, as well as our ability to monitor, detect those changes is also uncertain. And it's often difficult to decouple effects from harvest or environments across these complex life cycles that take salmon to and from the ocean and rivers. In other recent studies, in the past 10 years or so, a wide variety of quantitative tools have been used, including Statespace models, to detect shifts in productivity or regime shifts in productivity over time. And this has been done on a lot of commercial fishing salmon stocks like sockeye or pink salmon, which have experience similar ocean conditions, as they are all in the ocean at the same time, but they vary quite a bit in their freshwater environment, both from river to river and within a species, how they use the river. And as a consequence of a focus on these ocean conditions, a lot of changes in these productivity shifts over time have been attributed to marine drivers. That includes overfishing concerns or climate conditions and oscillations in the North Pacific. Yet we know that many of these salmon species vary in their freshwater life cycle, including the duration and amount of time they spend in the freshwater environment. This is also the environment where much of the density-dependent responses to lower densities are likely to occur, and also where most of the compensation to these lower densities occurs. So now we're going to focus in on what's been going on in the Coho River, which has been a useful long-term reference site that has been used in a wide variety of scientific studies on steelhead and other species. So the Coho River is a relatively small river on the northern end of Vancouver Island. It's about 31 kilometers long and drains about 130 square kilometers in area. There's been, since 1976, a long-term monitoring site focused in on steelhead, but also has 5 other species of sea-run migratory salmonids, and that includes Coho salmon, pink salmon, coastal cutthroat trout, Dolly Varden, in addition to steelhead. One of the major benefits that we have on this site is we've been able to install this fence count that is able to count downstream outmigrants of young juvenile steelhead as well as and coho, in addition to any upstream migrating adults that are coming back to the river for spawning. So in this case, we're able to get a really good census on kind of the outmigrating smolt cohorts and sample some of them for age structure and body sizes, in addition to these adult numbers and enumeration methods. Adults are often counted in this case with mark recapture methods of returning adults into the river, as well as a fence count, resistivity counter that's been used on pink salmon and coho salmon in more recent years, as well as stream walks from escapement data before 1997. So we've been able to compile 40 years of monitoring data that has revealed declining abundances for several of these species. So we developed a Bayesian time series model to evaluate some of the reasons and underlying mechanisms of these declines using a state space model. And that's been useful to recover kind of population dynamics through these noisy data sets, accounting for the natural and observation uncertainty that is inherent in salmon populations. And we do that on 2 different life stages in this case. So one, I developed a state space model to evaluate how freshwater drivers might be affecting the recruitment or smolt life stages of many of these species. And then secondly, I focus in on steelhead in particular, where I evaluate how marine and coastal conditions and changes might be affecting marine survival and adult female returns. This was specific to steelhead in this case because we had much more rich data set that was focused in on steelhead. And like I mentioned with that Ricker model, we're basically linearizing these density-dependent population dynamics to ask a fairly simple statistical question, which is a linear regression, and just how does that linear regression vary through time? So alongside these 40 years of changes in adult and smolt population dynamics over this time span, we've also seen substantial ecosystem changes in both the marine and freshwater environment. And this includes fluctuating ocean climates and oscillations, an increased coastal seal density, as well as not that we considered, but in this case, there's also sea lion densities that have increased in this area. We've seen an increased abundance of competing salmon, mostly from hatchery production increases over the years that are maybe outcompeting or reducing growth conditions and opportunities in the ocean. We also see a wide variety of freshwater changes, including warmer rivers, warmer winters, variable flow regimes, changing rainfall conditions, and also this long-term and persistent signal of increased logging within the watershed. So one of the key questions when we come back to this idea of density dependence is what about the system might be changing? There's 2 leading hypotheses when we think about this linear form of the Ricker model, for example. We have this alpha term, which is the baseline maximum productivity at the origin at 0 densities, how many smolts would be produced per adult. And what that would do if we were to reduce that productivity, say by 50%, is we drop this recruitment curve down, but it's a parallel line. So it's just a reduction to everything across all densities equally. So we change the maximum smolts that might be produced at the same adult density. But another hypothesis out there is that we actually might see a change in the density dependent parameter itself. And this changes the maximum smolts produced but at a lower adult density in this case, if we were to increase the strength of density dependence in this in the same direction of 50%. Compared to the two models, if you were to increase density dependence in this population, what ends up happening is that low density years actually become better than a simple change in productivity. As you can see here at the lower limit, we actually get more productivity in the system. But at high density years, this would become worse, as productivity is actually lower than a simple 50% reduction in the intrinsic productivity or maximum productivity of the system. And these two questions are important to disentangle because it has a key influence on how resilient the populations are of interest at lower adult densities. So using that data set, particularly on Steelhead, we asked this question really quick: what of those two hypotheses, or the combination of the two of them, is really underlying the population dynamics over time? And so using leave one out cross-validation comparisons, which briefly is the predictive accuracy of a model to the data itself, is the answer comes away overwhelmingly that it was a time-varying productivity question. In fact, if you look on the right-hand side, we can see the relative fits to the data. And in the top panel is our time-varying productivity, or that shifting intercept model, and it fits the data pretty well. Our second model, the time-varying density dependence, an increase or relaxation of density dependence, fits the data decently well, but you can see large gaps in its ability to predict the data. And when we ask the question, are both of these changing through time? The model just absolutely is bad. It is a very yucky fit to the data. And overall, this suggests strongly that maximum productivity, or the origin of the stock recruitment curve, was changing. And what this ends up looking like is that with 40 years of data, we essentially see 40 different manifestations of the recruitment curve, the productivity of the system. Each one is parallel to the year before and related to the year before in this sense. So we get an idea that the actual productivity is shifting and fluctuating through time. So what this looks like for all 5 species of interest is a long-term trend through time of the maximum productivity for each of these species. And some of them are highly correlated to one another. We kind of defined 3 general regimes. They varied within each species, but 3 general regimes in productivity, where we defined it from 1976 to about 1990. Things were more or less consistent. There was kind of a flat productivity. Productivity was about the same as it used to be. And then all of a sudden, there seemed to be a steady rise across multiple species in productivity, as they might have been trying to compensate to something changing in the system. But more recently, in the last 10 years or so, has been a sharp decline in that productivity. And that's been seen in both Dolly Varden, Steelhead, Cutthroat. And there's a worrisome sign with Coho as well. But just notice on the bottom here, pink salmon, which happen to have the shortest life cycle of these 5 species, are basically just doing fine. They are pretty steady throughout time. So overall, there's these large oscillations in juvenile productivity, but there's worrisome signs in how much compensation at low densities these species are going to be able to have. Additionally, we can focus in on the environmental covariates that are explaining some of the remaining unexplained productivity in the system. And we can see, for example, that cumulative logging, that logging effect that we've seen in the watershed, is explaining, has a strong negative association on productivity for steelhead, coastal cutthroat trout, and coho salmon. So logging is just not good on smolt productivity of these three species, or at least it's associated with large declines. We also have these uncertain effects. For example, the increased spawning date the reduced spawning date as steelhead are spawning earlier in the winter, for example, is associated with this slightly moderately negative relationship on productivity. So there are these sort of weaker and uncertain effects, but they might be there. Alternatively, we also have other covariates, like how are pink salmon responding to these increases in changing ocean conditions, like increased seal densities or increases to salmon in the North Pacific. And we see overall pinks in this system are not responding to that. There's no effect of those interactions explaining their productivity. So when we look at logging impacts in particular, if we ask this question on residual productivity, this is the smolt productivity, if all other factors, density, environment, intrinsic productivity, if all other factors were held constant, how many smolts are produced per adult female? We can see that there is a strong signal in the residual effects and productivity with logging. This is what we mean when we say that there's a logging effect, is that logging is just basically driving a lot of these residuals lower. And what this really does to the population is it places a large burden, lowering their population productivity over time. As we see on the left-hand side is basically the 1976 logging effects. And by the right-hand side, we have the 2010s onward. So there's a persistent increase in logging signal over this time. And this has led to the equivalent. If you can imagine that these fish are kind of weightlifters and they max out with a 100-pound squat, we're basically putting a 97-pound weight on their back. But of course, we know that not all else is equal over these time spans. And like good weightlifters, they have an ability to kind of lift themselves back up a little bit and try to counter this burden. And that was through those mechanisms of potentially changes in Ricker that alpha term that I showed on the previous plot, as productivity increased slowly after the 1990s, in addition to potentially boosts from other density dependent processes. So not all else was equal over this time span, and these populations are attempting to counterbalance this big burden that logging might be associated with in these populations. And as we evaluated whether logging had a consistent effect, no matter how long back we lagged these effects through time, we found it was indeed persistent. For steelhead in particular, we see if we lag these logging effects by 5, 10, 15, up to 30 years, there was still a strong negative relationship. For coho, the longer we lagged it, the worse the effects seemed to get. But for Dolly Varden and pink salmon, there was no evidence that there's no strong evidence that they were associated with the logging impacts at all. So if we bring back the question to the whole steelhead life cycle, we ask the question of other things were changing and going on during this time, including marine survival and the total number of returning adults. What was affecting them? So we found that through over these past 40 years, marine survival was strongly negatively associated with this ocean interaction index, which is the combination of salmon abundance in the North Pacific, but also seal densities in the coastal environment. In addition, positively related to the North Pacific gyre oscillations. In terms of adult female returns, we found that they were both equally explained by how many smolts went out to sea, in addition to the marine survival of those smolts. So they were about equally explaining how many adults ended up returning. But what we also see is that recent productivity is concerningly lower than it used to be. And we have this population that is now bottlenecked at low densities, low survival in both the river and in the ocean. And that's really concerning. So the consequences of this regime shift in productivity, we can kind of focus in on these three different regimes overall, is that we have this 1976 to 1990 time period where we generally speaking had good marine survival of around 10% of smolts survived and came back as adults. We generally had good adult returns, about 550 adult females returned to the Kee River, and about 8,500 smolts were produced per spawning cohort. So things were good. After around 1991, we had a sharp decrease in marine survival that has been associated with those changing marine stressors, and a reduction down to about 3% on average. So we're getting now about 75 adults on average returning to the Keogh River for spawning since that time point. Productivity is then caught in this balancing act. Some smolt productivity is increased because of lower densities. That's expected in a sustainable population. The intrinsic maximum productivity has increased over time with this regime shift, but we've also had lowering productivity that's been associated with these increased freshwater stressors like logging or changing rainfall or winter temperatures. So in this declining regime, more recently, what we see is now no longer is that intrinsic maximum productivity increasing. It's actually going back down, and we're actually getting fewer smolts, slightly fewer smolts than we were in the previous 10 years. This is, in the meantime, marine survival is still remaining low, but steady at around 3%. So we're just getting a little bit fewer smolts, and we're not bouncing back out of this bottleneck at low densities. So you can kind of use these kind of results to ask a what if question. What would be the expected recruitment if we didn't have these environmental stressors? And we can focus in on this compensatory regime from 1991 to 2010. And our findings show that if freshwater stressors were absent, we might have expected a boost in smolt productivity from this regime shift, leading to an increase in the maximum productivity of the whole system. And if that were the case, those same 75 adults that were returning back to the river after 1991 might have instead produced around 7,000 smolts, not just 1,900, almost a threefold increase in smolt production overall. And at the same 3% marine survival, that could have produced not 75 adult females, but around 213 females, threefold increase in adults. So it seemed that there was these non-stationary regime shifts that were affecting the population, but it might have been early on a potential compensatory response that was helping turn the tide against worse marine survival. But unfortunately, these freshwater stressors are present, and they were keeping steelhead bottlenecked and squeezed at low freshwater survival and marine survival. When we look at some of the spatial impacts among the Keogh River, we focus in on logging in particular, and we can see since 1984, for example, to 2020, substantial patchy clear-cut effects. On the bottom here, you can see Keogh Lake, which is towards the headwaters of the whole watershed. On the left, you see Keogh Lake here as well. So we do have some of these patches of clear cuts have been opening up near the river. Now, a recent paper by Will Atlas in 2015 suggested that there was the spatial contraction effect of how fry and parr are using the Keogh River watershed, and that upstream sites were in decline in terms of how many fry were present after the 1991 increase or decrease in marine survival. There's an argument presented here that these might be carryover effects from the ocean, where it could be that adult females are not getting to up towards the headwaters, or adult female body sizes have changed that has fundamentally altered how many eggs and therefore fry or are eventually get into the system. But these upstream sites are also the warmest, and in this case, Wolf Creek, for example, peak summer high temperatures are consistently reaching over 20 degrees Celsius. So these upstream sites may also be sensitive to those impacts from logging, more sensitive than the more downstream sites where temperatures get more stable and cooler on the way down as tributaries flow into the main stem. And we know that those upstream sites have been affected by logging from that time-lapse photo. There's large clear cuts in the watershed. So these two hypotheses, these two ideas are not mutually exclusive. So in summation for the Keogh, we've got these species that have this extensive freshwater life cycle, the Dolly Varden, coastal cutthroat trout, and steelhead. We see this lowering productivity. We see that these species are affected by many drivers, both marine and freshwater drivers. For coho, which has some portion of their life cycle is spent in freshwater, we see some worrisome signs. We're a little concerned. They are affected by logging, but they are a faster life cycle. They don't spend that long in freshwater. So I would say worrisome, but still doing okay. And we see that some of their smolt numbers are doing quite strong in recent years overall, when we'll just have to keep an eye on them. And for species like pink salmon, which have this very brief freshwater use, they're doing fine, at least in this river in particular. They've maintained their productivity and they're doing pretty well. So I want to shift next to these kind of a similar study on the productivity and trends and harvest management of North and Central Coast Coho. So in Coho, in this area, they have been recovering since the 1990s crash and closure of several of these fisheries. And this is a region of the coast kind of north of Vancouver Island, but south of the Skeena. And we've seen recent declines, though, after this recovery, of recent declines in spawner escapement. And this is of major concern, both for commercial fishing operations as well as Indigenous harvest. We know that after that closure, Coho recovered really strongly, and harvest hit an all-time high in the early to mid 2000s. And has been steadfast in the recent 10 years. And you can see that in this logbook and of lodge and charter harvests since the 1990s. But in recent years, we've seen that even coho catch rates in the sport fishing sector have been declining. For example, in this area, the Central Coast, we've seen declines of about 48% in total catch rates since 2012. So it suggests that harvest has been maintained at decently high levels despite declining catches. And this is a worrisome sign if you're in fisheries management, as there's a sense that the population is declining, but we're not necessarily doing anything about it yet. So similar to the Keogh study, we evaluated the population dynamics, the density-dependent population dynamics from this 40-year time period from 1980 to 2020. And we used data from 52 of the best monitored populations in this area and fit that same style of time series, state-space models, to allow to ask questions of shifting productivity and regime changes, to then ask a question of how much risk is there moving forward, and how can we better manage coho populations given this uncertain future? So what we see is across 6 large regions, Area 6, Hecate Lowlands, Skeena, Haida Gwaii, is that many of these regions are having massive declines and potentially record low numbers in the most recent cohorts in their recruitment productivity. And so we ended up developing this Bayesian model to forward simulate 3 generations from the latest escapement data sets to ask questions of what predicts the most recent not used data to this forward simulation model, and can we then harvest these populations in the model in a simulation sense at various harvest rates to ask a question of what management leads to better coho conservation objectives. And these productivity trends that we evaluated was a return of productivity to the long-term average. Productivity continues on its current downward trajectory across these 6 regions, or a random walk into the future, which is just, it goes anywhere it wants to. So as we evaluated these 52 populations, we found that most populations were below their status of conservation concern in recent years. In fact, for recent data, we only had 45 populations that had any data since 2015. So 29 of 45 populations fell below those targets. But there's large uncertainty, which I think leaves room for improved management moving forward in the next 3 generations. Here we see that that predicted data is in blue here, the data that we're going to sort of test how well the model is performing. And overall, we see that of these 3 productivity trends, we see strong evidence for declining productivity moving forward. But that varies from population to population. Here on this figure, we see the predictive accuracy, or actually the error in the predictions, where larger numbers are bad. And we see the trending model is the best model at reducing that error of the 3 that were considered. That's on the aggregate sense. But on the population or river by river metric, some of these models seem like they might return to the long-term average, or some of these populations seem that they might return to the average. Some seem like they're going to continue declining into the future. So if we then look at the harvest scenarios that we explored, moving 3 generations forward of that current trend of declining productivity, we ask the question, well, what harvest levels on the commercial fishing side of things might do better? And we evaluated a continuation of status quo harvest, a 50% reduction in the BC commercial fleet, a 50% reduction in the Alaska fleet, or potentially harvest closures. And we found that generally speaking, the moderate reductions in 50%, that would be huge, doesn't actually alter the conservation targets here. We actually see 70% of the time we're still below our conservation target if we just maintained harvest at the status quo. If we reduced harvest by half, we actually only changed that number to about 80% of the time we're below the conservation target. Whereas if we actually closed commercial fishing altogether, we would move that up to about 110% of the populations end up being, we are above the conservation target 1.1 fold. So we're actually increasing our conservation objectives by this potential harvest closure. But as we move forward across these scenarios 3 generations from now, we see that harvest ends up having a limited effect, that this downward decline in productivity still leads to lower spawner escapement going forward. So harvest has a limited effect. So while we may need to consider some extreme closures, it's not the only thing that's really driving the system. This was of such concern more recently that, in fact, the federal minister in fisheries closed several of these coho fisheries overall in 2021. And so we're moving into this sort of management paradigm where we're not even considering reducing harvest, but at times kind of altering on and off toggles of closures and harvest, closures and harvest. And I think we can probably do better. So overall, we're seeing that Pacific salmon in British Columbia are exhibiting large fluctuations in their productivity, their population dynamics. And some of these are leading into this regime shifts of low productivity, both in marine and in freshwater conditions. We see that these patterns are going to vary among regions and watersheds. And so the underlying reasons of these productivity shifts may vary from population to population, but I think that there are some common drivers. Similarly, we've seen these sharp declines more recently in North and Central Coast coho, and these declines do seem likely to continue based on that predictive forward simulation model. And fishery harvest and overfishing concerns are not the only issue at play, even though it's one of the only management levers that we often consider to effectively improve these fisheries. And overall, I think these salmon and trout populations are getting squeezed from lower survival in both the rivers and in ocean. Freshwater stressors like logging or land use changes and climate changes are affecting juveniles and spawning conditions, whereas marine and coastal changes like the recovery of coastal seal predator populations or the abundance of Pacific salmon from hatchery production in the North Pacific is affecting adult and marine survivals. So I think there's an opportunity to improve or maybe even reinvent how we manage salmon more holistically. And that might include watershed level management or community-based management, where that affords a more powerful and transformative option moving forward, where we monitor salmon at their local river level and maybe move salmon harvest from mixed stock fishing in the ocean and into more locally targeted harvest opportunities where we really know what we're catching and how much we're catching and what population we're hitting. And I think the combination of both of these kinds of approaches and watershed scale management might more effectively address these large scale stressors and drivers that are affecting these populations. So with that, I want to acknowledge my co-authors for the Keogh paper, Jonathan Moore, Colin Bailey, Trevor Davies, and as well as my colleagues on the Coho paper, which is with Charlotte Whitney, Will Atlas, and Brendan Connors, as well as the Central Coast Nations and my team and colleagues at Secura, and for the Kee River, both monitoring, technical support, science support, funding support from Instream Fisheries, Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation, Liber Eero, and many others from the province, from DFO, from NSERC, and my old lab mates at in the Salmon Watersheds lab. And with that, I am happy to take any questions.
Awesome presentation. Thanks, Dr. Wilson. Perfect. You have your screen share off. I guess Facebook, it sounds like, is having a bit of a heart attack and the feed is frozen. So we'll apologize on behalf of Facebook. But I've got a few questions lined up, and I think that things will start to get rolling here pretty quick. One thing, what about garbage in watersheds? And I guess these questions are kind of tied together. Loggers leave riparian zones in along the rivers and streams. Is that not working? Or is that not working?
So are we gonna we want to lump the two questions kind of together?
Yeah, I guess the garbage one, I mean, yeah, if you've looked into that at all, that's great.
No, I haven't looked into garbage necessarily. I would suspect it's overall not good. I think in terms of the riparian sort of buffer, I think the answer is probably not working at the scale of the buffers that we're providing. And I think in general, logging in salmon watersheds, because there's all sorts of flow impacts and potential temperature impacts to how water gets into the rivers eventually. I don't think logging in salmon watersheds, especially with clear cut, is a good thing for salmon and trout.
Gotcha. Thank you. This is about today. How are the increases in silt levels from recent floods in BC expected to affect Pacific salmon populations? I don't know if I'm sure there will be more questions about what's going on and what's happening right now. So if you have the expertise.
I don't have a good sense of what's happening in the rest of the province with the recent floods and storms. I know that both siltation and the pulsing of flows are likely going to increase scouring events, and scouring events are so we're at that critical time for a lot of salmon where they've either are spawning or have spawned and laid their eggs in their nests. And scouring events with high rainfall and siltation is going to erode both the nest itself with high flow events, and siltation might actually reduce the water quality that is necessary to sort of oxygenate and help those eggs develop into young baby salmon, basically. So not good.
Okay, thanks. There's a little bit of overlap here, and it's gonna get technical. This is around the logging piece and the lag effect. Tested a lot of variables against shifts in productivity, estimated using linear regression. Assume you use 95% confidence intervals. Does this limit your ability to say that logging or other variables were important or not important in explaining your estimates of time varying productivity? Would you need to run some sort of control to really, I guess, say logging was the reason? So this is really just getting at kind of, how does the lag work, and do you have anything to bounce that off of in terms of controls?
Yeah, I think the answer is we don't have controls really effectively in the system. This is one river, and we've got long-term data. And so we use these fancy statistical tools to provide as much control in the analysis phase of things as we can. But we don't necessarily have, say, a before and after control kind of study. Now, there is a neighboring sort of sister reference site in the Keogh called Carnation Creek. They did a long-term logging experiment that they found an interesting pattern over time of a temporary boost in coho productivity after logging, after some clear-cut logging. But then 15 to 20 years later, they started to see coho productivity just tank. And so there was this short-term improvement to productivity as potentially, like nutrients were flushed into the system, but long-term habitat erosion, worse flow, worse rearing habitat these coho were responding negatively after the initial boost. And so that's Carnation Creek. That's a study by Peter Chapinski, and I'm happy to send that around if people are interested. So they did do that control, and I thought it was really well done.
Okay, great. Again, about logging, was the logging indicator specific to cause or a more general indicator like the amount of logging? So I think that's more, is it the type of logging or is it the amount of logging?
It was the amount of logging, and most of the logging in this area is going to be clear cut. So it's pretty much one type of logging, and it's basically the amount of logging, the cumulative area logged within that window of the lag. So 5 years, it would be the last 5 years of total logging, things like that. So in this case, 15 years was what we ended up picking for the main results. So cumulative logging 15 years prior to that smolt, that brooding cohort and the rearing conditions that would affect that particular cohort.
Great. One around the differences in productivity between species might be explained by smolt size and consequent likelihood of being eaten by a predator in both fresh and salt water.
Yeah.
Dolly Varden productivity decline can be buffered by relatively abundant pink fry prey. How closely did you look at that piece?
Yeah, so we do know that pink salmon, young pink salmon and eggs and everything do facilitate the trout that are in the system. So we know that they kind of benefit from pink salmon being there. And that is often a good thing. We also feel that the kind of the trajectories as we're seeing it across the species is kind of related to how long lived they are and how coastal those life histories are. So sort of Dolly Varden and coastal cutthroat trout, probably when they migrate to sea, they don't go very far. It's kind of the idea there that might subject them more frequently to, say, seal predation. So I think you're right that there is some of these species are probably more vulnerable than others to that seal effect.
Great. Would changing our harvest methods from mixed stock ocean fishing to targeted stock fishing closer to terminal locations have any effect on our contribution requirements to the Pacific Salmon Treaty? Now, this may be getting a little bit far into policy, so if you don't know, that's totally okay.
I don't know the terms of the policy well enough to speak on that one.
Yeah, okay, great. Have you heard of the Salmon Works initiative being driven by 5 nations on the west coast of Vancouver Island? Curious of your thoughts or if you're aware of this project.
No, but I'd love to learn more about it. Maybe if I can get that name again, that would be great.
Okay, I will see if I can get you that. Do you have any data on floods within the past month? Curious if there's been any talk, any observations on red stability after the high water levels. If not, thank you for the great talk.
Yeah, I don't have that kind of data, but I think we're going to be like the broader sort of scientific community focusing in on salmon is going to have a lot to say about the recent storms.
Great. I'm just trying to get caught up here. You mentioned 50% reduction in coho catch in the north. The return is much smaller, so less fish are taken. You mentioned working with DFO. Is there a reason DFO is ignoring the science that you have put forth?
Well, I can't put words in their mouth. I am collaborating with DFO and many of us in the Central Coast nations and their technical staff, including myself, are working with DFO to address these problems. And they are collaborators and colleagues, not obstacles.
Excellent. I've got just somebody who's obviously a bit of knows a lot about the local area. Carnation Creek, the stream temperature increased, but this was also tied to increases in regional temperatures as well. So I guess kind of climate change tied into changing stream temperatures.
Yeah, and I think that the interaction of those two, I mean, trees help shade the river. They help store water and regulate flows. So I think the two go hand in hand. Removing the trees and exacerbates climate effects. I would think that that's a pretty intuitive interaction. we didn't necessarily have the data on that side of things in the Keogh River to really address that question.
Great. Now we're getting specific, but this is maybe in your area. Area 12 in particular, which includes the Keogh. There was a discussion paper in 2007 by Meinstein advocating that the wild salmon policy considers smaller scale conservation units to align with the scale that local communities experience and relate to salmon populations. Do you have any comments, opinions, suggestions with regards to the practical side of implementing local scale watershed management when many conservation units are very large, and that is the scale at which the wild salmon policy and theory DFO are considering populations?
Yeah, my personal opinion is I do think those smaller scales are going to be the way to go. I think moving forward and having more targeted, refined both management areas and locations of harvest into the rivers themselves, into terminal headwaters, those would be beneficial for most the communities, the local communities. I think it would be more sustainable in the long run to do that. An issue is how do we get from here where we do mixed stock fleet fishing to there? And I don't have a clear answer for that necessarily. And I think a lot of people are thinking about that and have creative solutions. But I do think a lot of Indigenous communities have been doing that for a long time. And I think we can learn a lot from listening to them on that aspect.
Awesome. Okay, here we have someone who's worked a lot on the Keogh, I'm guessing. The Keogh was subject to a program of intensive freshwater habitat restoration from 1994 to 2000, i.e. whole river fertilization, LWD, plus boulder placement, off-channel habitat, and headwater storage, all aimed at steelhead and coho to increase low summer flows and increase in-stream habitat for steelhead. Papers published by Ward et al. Showed a significant increase in recruits per spawners at low spawner densities as a result of these FW habitat restoration activities. Question 1, did you separate the years pre and post in-stream habitat enhancement to control for this in your analysis?
No, we actually added a covariate into the analysis for those years, asking whether those years consistently had higher productivity. Like cohorts from those years that were experiencing those effects had higher or lower productivity. We do detect that for some of these species. I think in Dolly Varden in particular, we picked that up, but in some of the other cases, we did not really pick that up. So we kind of controlled for that in the model itself by adding a covariate.
Awesome. Okay, very cool. And then 2, are we saying that in-stream restoration projects were not effective in the long term and were overwhelmed by climate plus logging changes in the watershed and variations in North Pacific productivity?
Generally, I would probably say that. Yeah, I think they were not effective in the long run.
Okay. We can't control. What is general residency time for steelhead in the Keogh? Did this change over time as part of the regime shifts?
Well, what was that in the Reds?
Residency time, I guess, before they head out to the Pacific.
Oh, I'd have to look into that. I don't think I have that off the top of my head. I'm not quite sure if that changed. I know we've seen changes in their overall spawning dates. The runs upstream got quite a bit earlier, almost a month earlier in some cases. But I'm not sure about overall residency. I do know, so Colin Bailey, my co-author on the paper, is also working on a lot of these questions in terms of how long adults spend at sea after they smolt towards and out migrate towards the ocean. So that, I think those aspects are being actively researched, and I do think there are changes, but I'm not sure about overall residency.
Okay, great.
Unless I'm just missing the question, in which case maybe it's easy to answer.
There's been a lot of controversy over salmon farming recently, strong claims regarding their impacts on wild salmon. Do you have any info on salmon farming and how it's impacting wild salmon, and what level of risk does it pose?
It's a little outside of my particular expertise. I do tend to focus in on population dynamics for wild salmon. I think overall, it's a complicated topic. There are many negative associations of some of these fish farms in terms of novel introduced viruses and their impacts on wild salmon that are brought to the attention of those that make these decisions. But it's not really my bread and butter for research. So I'm not quite sure.
Awesome. And we've got one comment on the smolt piece from somebody who obviously knows the system. Average 3 years smolts pre-fertilization and 2 year smolts when fertilized, and even 1 year smolts in extreme fertilization years. So there we go.
Right on.
Here's another good question. What variables in the study do you wish you had more robust long-term data for? If you had funding for more scientists and tools, what would be the first thing you would want to start monitoring, and what questions would you look to answer that your research hasn't been able to?
Yeah, so for the Keogh in particular, one of the questions that I think would be more fascinating is to see what flow is like overall from this time series, and especially across the whole watershed, because we know that the tributaries play a key role in regulating temperatures that are important for trout and char species to rear. So I think having a long-term flow and we started a water temperature monitoring study, but that was only in 2013 and on. So we don't capture that full scope of the time series going back all the way to 76. So I think that would have been a big asset for us. We've tried to reconstruct flow over the long run. Jordan Rosenfeld from the province was a key part of exploring that, but it just doesn't look like there's really any signal of hind casting what flow looked like from the available data. So I think that would be a really great one to have had. As well as sort of where we've done some studies of where the fry and the par are rearing in the system, but at like spatial information of where they're at in the watershed, so we can look at more local and more spatially refined questions of how density dependence really takes place in these salmon watersheds. I think that would have been really interesting.
Great. Does anyone else have any questions? I feel like there's probably a few people that have some. We've had some really awesome questions too, and good engagement here. I'm guessing there are. Is there, I'll ask one. Is there any intention in Jonathan's, Dr. Moore's lab to kind of keep moving on this one? I know, and are you able to speak to, there were a bunch of steelhead that were pit tagged, all right?
Yeah, so I think that there is some active work that we're definitely working on still. Colin Bailey's leading a number of different research items that I'm really excited to see how that comes into play. That includes looking at carryover effects, both from freshwater to the marine and back again. So I think that's going to be a key question that gets picked up. And then we are going to use that. We've got individual smolts tagged and some par tagged. And we might be able to really do a great job kind of reconstructing some individual life cycle and sort of how they use the environment and how often they come back, and that residency question. So I do think that there are a number of active research items, but I'm also aware that I think we've done a lot in the Keogh, and I think we're kind of at a point where we want to try to give it a little bit of a breathing room and see kind of where the population goes from here before we kind of implement some more research on it.
Okay. Here's one. Any direct correlation between snowpack levels in the interior and Pacific salmon productivity rates, and any insight on that?
So I don't have I don't often work in sort of snow dominated watersheds. Mostly I'm on coastal stuff right now, so I don't have a good sense of that. But I do think a number of people have been looking into that. So I imagine if that hasn't been worked on actively, like we could probably get some really good knowledge holders that have a good sense of that.
Cool. More of a methods or technology question. Have you used drones in the project?
No, I don't think so. There's a lot of people that have been working on the Keogh, and I think using drones to get some of those spatial impacts would be awesome, and just do runs of the watershed. That could be really cool. There is a lot of trees though at times, and it might be hard to operate depending on the scale, and the fallen trees and logs and all sorts of stuff. So it could be really fascinating to operate a drone in these conditions, but I've never done it.
Cool. This is a really good question. This kind of strikes to the applied side. What would you suggest for community groups to do in smaller creeks, i.e. on the Sunshine Coast? Our creeks aren't large, but if we work on them all, we can raise the salmon stock numbers. We want to do rehabilitation work and would appreciate your advice.
Ooh, that is a great question. I mean, I think in terms of restoration activities, stream restoration activities, it's a bit about choosing. There are shorter term benefits that habitat changes would do. Large woody debris, for example, anchored debris, things like that can help a cohort for a couple of years. But I think if you're not making sure that that's in the right place of the creek, if that doesn't flow with the natural flow regime of the creek, woody debris is supposed to kind of flow through watersheds, for example. So if you anchor it for too long, it might become ineffective. So I think it's about choosing a combination of restoration activities that really meet a wide variety of what the populations need now and need 5 years down the road. So I think it's not always about doing one restoration activity, which might help the population for a little bit. It's about doing a couple of different restoration activities, maybe doing that repeatedly through time, letting the population, letting that habitat improve, both like woody debris, let the trees kind of grow back next to the riparian area to help flow and help temperature conditions and help kind of like get the bank stabilities back. Those things are all really helpful. And I think in a long-term sense, that's going to be great.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a big one. That's the world we live in. How do we help? How do we help as opposed to watching it disappear?
Yeah.
Here's another one. Does angling happen in the Keogh, and does it affect the populations? Has there been any work done on angling effort and mortality rates?
For the most part, angling is pretty low in the Keogh. It's partly limited access. So you can really only access it through the airport, which is fenced off from most of the public. And a really keen angler can walk along the beach a couple of miles and then start walking upstream to get to places that could be angled more efficiently. But generally speaking, angling is just really not a big concern on this population, which I think makes it a big asset to study, is that it's kind of controlling for some of these other pressures that other systems have.
Awesome. Is LiDAR a usable tool for monitoring regeneration along coastal rivers?
Yeah, definitely, for sure. Yeah, I am not an expert on sort of geoscience and remote sensing operations, but we definitely are able to use LiDAR or other vegetation indices to get a sense of regrowth. What you don't get a sense of oftentimes from those, you get foliage and things like that. You don't always get a sense of sort of the quality of the trees in regards to the hydrograph and the watershed conditions. And so they're not always the same, which is why we have these sometimes delayed logging effects, right? Like 15, 30 years down the road, we might still see impacts from logging. And that's because the trees themselves are not yet back to what they used to be, even if foliage is. So they're useful tools, but limited.
Sure. Yep. Same as in the wildlife world. It shows you a plant. It doesn't tell you what the digestible energy is or the protein content or anything like that.
Yeah.
I'm not very familiar with the Keogh. Are there changes in stream connectivity from culverts or other anthropogenic sources that may affect migration?
In terms of upstream all the way towards Keogh Lake, I can't think of anything in particular that comes to mind as obstacles. Low flow conditions. I mean, sometimes the river is pretty darn low, but I don't think during the spawning run would that be the case. So I don't think so.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I feel like you've had your turn. You've got probably had enough talking for one day. You started early on this. So
yeah.
Dr. Wilson, really appreciate your time. Phenomenal paper, phenomenal presentation, really good engagement. Thanks for the people that tuned in and asked some really good questions. And for the people who clearly have a really good handle on the Keough system as well, who've spent a lot of time. I feel like there's a lot of gray matter that has a lot of insight into the Keough here. So really nice to see.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a ton of very, very smart, very keen scientists on this project for 40 years.
Yeah. So it's good. It's one of our few examples where we have good data. So just want to thank everyone and just circle back around again and say, you know, the reason why we have these webinars is to help educate people and bring, you know, some of the best science and the best scientists we have in BC to you. But this, you know, just bringing it to you doesn't help. If you can share it on your social media and forward it on to your friends and colleagues and coworkers and talk about it when you're out in the woods doing what you do, that's where we really get a lot of value in these webinars. So if you can please share this, that would be great. The next topic, as I said, is going to be will wildfires and wildlife coexist, with Dr. Daniels and Bob Gray. And so they are going to look out even into 2050 and give us a good idea on how we can manage the landscape for it to be more resilient to fire and also for wildlife. That is going to be December 14th. Thanks again, Dr. Wilson, for taking the time. And this was a quick turnaround, you know, pretty quick after you published the paper. Thanks to Brian, Tasaka, and everybody at the BCWF office for putting the time and energy to get this up and running. And I think that's it for tonight. So
awesome. Well, thanks for having me, everybody. And it was great to get a chance to speak about our research.
Appreciate it. Keep up the great work.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Good night.